The Winchester rifle cracked across the canyon, its echo rolling like thunder through the pine-covered ridges. 200 yards down the slope, Brandon Gutierrez stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder where Dorothy Jackson's bullet had found its mark. Not fatal, but precise enough to drop his weapon and send a clear message to the remaining four men scattered behind the rocks. Dorothy worked the lever action with practiced ease, chambering another round without taking her steel-gray eyes off the targets below. The morning mist clung to the mountainside, providing perfect cover as she shifted position along the granite outcropping she'd chosen 3 hours before dawn. Every sight line calculated, every escape route mapped, every advantage hers. Andrew Thompson's voice carried up from behind a fallen log. "We know who you are now, Dorothy, the legendary ghost of Copper Ridge. Thought you were dead." Dorothy's weathered face showed no emotion as she adjusted her grip on the rifle stock. The weapon felt as natural in her hands as Rain's had for the past 12 years, since she'd hung up her federal marshal's badge and tried to disappear into the quiet life of a widow running horses on a remote Montana homestead. "I was dead," she called back, her voice carrying the same calm authority that had once commanded respect in the territorial courts. "You brought me back. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. This story of how a group of thieves made the worst mistake of their lives is just getting started." 3 days earlier, Dorothy had been a different woman entirely, or at least she'd been pretending to be. The morning had started like every other for the past 12 years. Dorothy rose before dawn in her small cabin, built coffee over the wood stove, and stepped onto the porch to watch the sun paint the peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains. At 52, she moved with the efficient grace of someone who'd learned to waste no motion, whether breaking horses or surviving winters alone at 8,000 feet elevation. Her property stretched across a high valley that most folks considered too remote and too harsh for decent living. That isolation was exactly why Dorothy had chosen it. The nearest neighbor lived 15 miles down a barely passable mountain road. The county sheriff's office was 40 miles beyond that. Out here, a woman had to handle her own problems. Dorothy's morning routine included checking the horses in the corral, inspecting fence lines for damage from elk or weather, and maintaining the equipment that kept her small operation running. She raised and trained mountain horses, animals bred for endurance and sure footing in terrain that would challenge most riders. Her reputation for producing reliable mounts had slowly spread through the territory, bringing enough business to keep her solvent without drawing unwanted attention. The horses knew her step and whickered soft greetings as she approached the corral. But this morning, something was wrong. Dorothy's hand automatically moved to rest on the Colt revolver she wore beneath her wool coat, a habit she'd never quite broken despite 12 years of peaceful living. The corral gate hung open. Dorothy's eyes swept the enclosure with the systematic precision that had once made her the most effective federal marshal in the Montana Territory. 5 horses should have been waiting for their morning hay. Only 4 stood clustered near the water trough, ears pricked forward with nervous energy. Storm Runner was gone. Dorothy knelt beside the gate, reading the story written in the churned earth with skills that most people had forgotten were possible. 3 men on horseback had approached in the pre-dawn darkness. They'd known exactly which animal they wanted. Storm Runner was no ordinary horse. The black stallion descended from Spanish stock, crossed with wild Mustang bloodlines, bred for intelligence and stamina. Dorothy had spent 3 years training him, and he was worth more than most men earned in 5 years of hard labor. But Storm Runner represented more than money. He was the last horse her husband Thomas had helped her select before the fever took him. Training Storm Runner had been Dorothy's way of honoring Thomas's memory, keeping alive the dream they'd shared of building something lasting in this harsh but beautiful country. The thieves' tracks led northeast toward the high passes. Dorothy followed them for a quarter mile, noting details that would have been invisible to untrained eyes. The lead rider favored his left stirrup, suggesting an old injury. The second horse threw its right rear shoe slightly wide, creating a distinctive mark. The third mount was freshly shod with shoes that bore the distinctive stamp of the blacksmith in Millfield, 30 miles east. Dorothy had seen enough. These weren't random horse thieves looking for quick money. They'd scouted her property, identified her best animal, and planned the theft carefully. That level of organization suggested they were part of something larger. She returned to the cabin and opened the wooden chest beneath her bed. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather, lay the tools of her former trade. The federal marshal's badge, tarnished with age. A second Colt revolver, its grips worn smooth by years of use. A leather folder containing warrants and correspondence that proved Dorothy Campbell Jackson had once been one of the most feared law enforcement officers in the territory. Dorothy had earned the nickname Ghost of Copper Ridge during her 8 years as a marshal. She could track fugitives across terrain that defeated other lawmen. She could read signs that others couldn't see and appear in places that seemed impossible to reach. More than one outlaw had sworn she could walk through walls or disappear into thin air when pursuit became inconvenient. The truth was simpler, but no less effective. Dorothy understood that survival in the wilderness required becoming part of the landscape rather than fighting against it. She'd learned to move silently, to use terrain for concealment, and to strike with precision when action became necessary. Those skills had made her legendary among both criminals and fellow officers. But Dorothy had put that life behind her when she married Thomas Jackson, a quiet man who'd owned the mountain property and shared her love of horses and solitude. For 8 years, they'd built a peaceful life together. When Thomas died, Dorothy had chosen to honor his memory by maintaining that peace. Now someone had forced her to remember who she used to be. Dorothy strapped on both revolvers and selected her Winchester rifle from the gun cabinet. She saddled Copper, her most reliable mount, and loaded supplies for several days in the wilderness. If the thieves thought they could steal from Dorothy Jackson and disappear into the mountains, they were about to learn how wrong they were. The trail led through increasingly difficult terrain as Dorothy followed the thieves northeast into the high country. She rode steadily but carefully, reading the signs they'd left behind and building a picture of who she was tracking. 3 men, as she'd determined from the initial tracks. The leader rode with confidence, taking direct routes and showing familiarity with the mountain passes. The second rider was less experienced, allowing his horse to waste energy on unnecessary climbs and descents. The third man rode a horse that was beginning to favor its left front leg, suggesting they were pushing their mounts harder than wise. By afternoon, Dorothy had closed the distance considerably. The thieves had stopped for a meal beside a creek, leaving clear evidence of their passage. Boot prints in the mud showed that one man walked with a pronounced limp. Tobacco ash indicated they'd spent at least an hour resting their horses. Dorothy studied the tracks leading away from the creek and smiled grimly. The thieves were heading for Devil's Canyon, a narrow passage through the mountains that offered only one way in and one way out. If she could reach the far end of the canyon before they emerged, she could trap them in the passage. Dorothy knew these mountains better than any living person. She'd spent years tracking fugitives through every ridge and valley, learning shortcuts and hidden trails that didn't appear on any map. While the thieves followed the main trail through Devil's Canyon, Dorothy could take a more direct route across the high ridges and arrive at the eastern exit hours before them. She turned Copper toward the steep slope that led to the ridge trail. The path was treacherous, little more than a game trail that wound between loose rock and stunted pines. But Dorothy had ridden this route before, and Copper was sure-footed enough to handle the challenge. As she climbed toward the ridge, Dorothy felt the familiar clarity that had always accompanied her most dangerous assignments. Her senses sharpened. Every sound became significant. Every movement in her peripheral vision demanded attention. The peaceful widow who'd spent 12 years training horses was transforming back into the predator who'd once been the most effective hunter of men in the Montana Territory. The sun was setting behind the western peaks when Dorothy reached the eastern mouth of Devil's Canyon. She'd made excellent time across the ridge, arriving with hours to spare before the thieves could emerge from the narrow passage. The canyon exit was a perfect natural choke point, with steep walls on both sides and only a narrow trail that forced travelers to ride single file. Dorothy positioned herself on a rocky outcropping 40 feet above the trail, with clear sight lines in both directions and multiple escape routes if the situation turned against her. She unsaddled Copper and hobbled him in a small meadow where he could graze while remaining hidden from anyone passing below. As darkness fell, Dorothy settled into wait. She'd learned patience during her years as a marshal, understanding that the hunter who moved too quickly often became the hunted. Better to choose the time and place for confrontation than react to someone else's plan. The thieves emerged from Devil's Canyon just after midnight, riding slowly and talking in low voices that carried clearly in the still mountain air. Dorothy recognized the lead rider immediately. Brandon Gutierrez had been a wanted man when she was still wearing a badge, suspected of running stolen livestock from Montana into Canada. He'd always managed to stay one step ahead of the law, but Dorothy had come close to catching him twice. The second rider was younger, probably in his 20s, with the nervous energy of someone new to the outlaw life. The third man sat his saddle awkwardly, favoring his left side in a way that suggested old wounds. Stormrunner walked between them on a lead rope, his black coat gleaming in the moonlight. The stallion's ears were pinned back with anger, and he pulled against the rope with every step. Dorothy felt a surge of fierce pride. Stormrunner was fighting his captors even in restraint. Dorothy waited until all three riders had passed beneath her position before making her move. She stood slowly, the Winchester ready in her hands, and spoke in the same calm voice she'd once used to address juries in territorial courtrooms. "That's far enough, gentlemen. You have something that belongs to me." The thieves reined in their horses and looked around frantically, trying to locate the source of her voice. In the darkness, Dorothy was invisible against the rocky background, but her words carried clearly through the night air. Brandon Gutierrez was the first to recover his composure. "Well now, looks like we got ourselves a situation. You want to come down here and discuss this like civilized folks?" Dorothy's laugh held no humor. "I tried civilized when I gave you the chance to leave my property unmolested. You chose a different path." The younger rider's voice cracked with nervous energy. "Brandon, there's nobody up there. She's bluffing." Dorothy shifted positions silently, moving 20 feet to her left before speaking again. "Andrew Thompson, isn't it? You're riding a horse shod by Pete Morrison in Millfield. Distinctive work, easy to track." Andrew Thompson's horse danced sideways as its rider jerked the reins in surprise. "How does she know that?" "Because I know things," Dorothy replied. "I know Brandon Gutierrez has been running stolen stock through these mountains for 15 years. I know Larry Lee there is riding with cracked ribs from that saloon fight in Butte last month. And I know all three of you are about to make the worst decision of your lives." Brandon's voice carried forced confidence. Big talk from someone hiding in the rocks. "Why don't you come down here and back up those words?" Dorothy's response was a single rifle shot that struck the ground 6 inches from Brandon's horse's front hooves. The animal reared and spun, nearly unseating its rider. The echo of the gunshot rolled through the canyon like thunder. "That was a warning," Dorothy said calmly. "The next shot won't miss what I'm aiming at." Larry Lee's horse was fighting the bit, sensing its rider's fear. "Lady, you don't know who you're dealing with. We got business associates who don't take kindly to interference." Dorothy had heard similar threats countless times during her years as a marshal. Men who lived outside the law often believed that reputation and intimidation could substitute for competence. They were usually wrong. "Your business associates aren't here," Dorothy observed. "It's just you three and me. And you're in my territory now." Andrew Thompson was young enough to let anger override caution. "This is crazy, Brandon. It's one woman. We can take her." Dorothy's second shot shattered a branch 2 feet above Andrew's head, raining pine needles down on the young rider. Andrew's horse bolted forward several steps before he could regain control. "That was your education, Andrew," Dorothy said. "The next lesson will be more permanent." Brandon Gutierrez had survived 15 years as an outlaw by knowing when to fight and when to negotiate. He raised his hands slowly, still holding his reins. "All right, lady, you got our attention. What do you want?" Dorothy's answer was simple and direct. "My horse, unharmed, and your word that you'll never set foot on my property again." Brandon considered this for a long moment. "And if we agree to those terms, you ride away, tonight, and we never see each other again." Larry Lee's voice carried skepticism. "Just like that, you let us go." Dorothy's tone remained level. "I'm not a bounty hunter anymore, Larry. I'm not interested in collecting old warrants or settling old scores. I just want what's mine." The three thieves exchanged glances, conducting a silent conference. Dorothy could see the calculation in their postures. 3 armed men against 1 woman, even if that woman had demonstrated impressive marksmanship. The odds seemed to favor action over negotiation. Dorothy recognized the signs of impending violence and prepared accordingly. She'd given them a chance to resolve the situation peacefully. If they chose differently, she was ready to remind them why the ghost of Copper Ridge had been legendary. Brandon Gutierrez made his decision. "Boys, I think we're being played by someone who's gotten too old for this game. Take her. The three riders spurred their horses forward, drawing weapons as they charged toward the rocky outcropping where they thought Dorothy was positioned. But Dorothy was no longer there. She'd moved again during the conversation, circling around to a position that gave her a clear field of fire and multiple escape routes. Her third shot took Andrew Thompson's hat off his head and sent it spinning into the darkness. Her fourth shot struck Larry Lee's rifle, tearing it from his hands and leaving him with stinging palms. Her fifth shot punched through the cantle of Brandon's saddle, close enough to his spine that he could feel the heat of the bullet's passage. All three men dove from their horses, seeking cover among the rocks at the base of the canyon wall. Their mounts scattered, including Stormrunner, who broke free during the confusion and galloped toward the meadow where Dorothy had hidden Copper. "Now it's interesting," Dorothy called out. Three men on foot in unfamiliar territory, facing someone who knows every rock and tree for 50 miles in any direction. Brandon's voice carried from behind a boulder. "You made your point, lady, but this isn't over. We got friends, resources. You can't watch your back forever." Dorothy smiled in the darkness. "That sounded like a threat, Brandon. I thought we were negotiating." She moved again, ghosting between the rocks with the silent efficiency that had made her reputation. The thieves could hear her voice but could never pinpoint her location. It was psychological warfare designed to erode their confidence and force them into mistakes. Larry Lee's nerves were fraying. "Brandon, this ain't normal. Nobody shoots like that in the dark." Dorothy's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "I had good teachers, Larry. The Crows showed me how to move without sound. The Army taught me to shoot. The federal marshals gave me plenty of practice on men who thought they were smarter than the law." Andrew Thompson's voice cracked with fear. "She's the ghost, the one from the stories." Dorothy had heard those stories over the years, growing in the telling until they bore little resemblance to reality. But fear was a useful tool, and she wasn't above using the legend to her advantage. "The stories are mostly true," she confirmed. "Though I never actually walked through walls, I just knew where the doors were." Brandon was trying to maintain control of the situation. "Enough games. Show yourself and we'll settle this proper." Dorothy's laugh echoed off the canyon walls. "Proper. Like stealing horses in the middle of the night. Like threatening a widow living alone. Your definition of proper is interesting, Brandon." She could see all three men from her current position, crouched behind inadequate cover and growing more nervous by the minute. Dorothy had the advantage of position, superior knowledge of the terrain, and weapons that outranged anything they carried. More importantly, she had the patience to wait for them to make the next mistake. The standoff continued through the long hours before dawn. Dorothy maintained her position on the high ground, moving periodically to keep the thieves guessing about her location. The three men below remained pinned behind their rocky cover, unable to advance or retreat without exposing themselves to her rifle. As the sky began to lighten in the east, Dorothy could see the toll that fear and exhaustion were taking on her opponents. Andrew Thompson kept glancing toward the canyon mouth, clearly wanting to run. Larry Lee was favoring his injured ribs, the stress of the situation aggravating his old wounds. Only Brandon Gutierrez maintained any semblance of composure, but even he was beginning to show signs of strain. Dorothy had learned during her martial days that most confrontations were won before the first shot was fired. Superior position, better preparation, and psychological pressure could defeat superior numbers if applied correctly. The thieves were discovering that lesson the hard way. The morning mist began to rise from the valley floor, providing Dorothy with additional concealment as she prepared for the final phase of the encounter. She'd given the thieves multiple opportunities to surrender and leave peacefully. They'd chosen to escalate the situation into violence. Now they would face the consequences of that decision. Stormrunner had found Copper in the hidden meadow, and both horses were grazing peacefully, apparently unconcerned by the human drama playing out nearby. Dorothy smiled at the sight. Animals often showed better judgment than people. Brandon's voice carried across the rocks, hoarse from hours of tension. "Lady, this has gone on long enough. We're willing to call it even. Leave the horse and walk away." Dorothy's response was calm and final. "That horse isn't yours to give away, Brandon, and I don't negotiate with thieves." She could see Brandon conferring with his companions, their voices too low to carry. Whatever they were planning, Dorothy was ready. She'd positioned herself with clear sight lines to all three men and multiple escape routes if the situation required rapid movement. Andrew Thompson made the first move, breaking from cover in a desperate sprint toward the canyon mouth. Dorothy's shot took him in the leg, dropping him 20 yards from safety. The young man screamed and clutched his wounded thigh, but the injury wasn't life-threatening. Dorothy had aimed to disable, not kill. Larry Lee tried to take advantage of the distraction, rushing toward a larger boulder that would provide better cover. Dorothy's second shot struck the ground at his feet, sending up a spray of rock fragments that convinced him to dive back behind his original position. Brandon Gutierrez recognized that the situation had become hopeless. His companions were wounded or pinned down, their horses were scattered, and they faced an opponent who clearly outmatched them in skill and preparation. But pride and desperation made him attempt one final gambit. Brandon broke from cover with both revolvers drawn, firing rapidly as he charged up the slope toward Dorothy's last known position. It was a brave but futile gesture. Dorothy had anticipated the move and shifted position minutes earlier. Her answering shot took Brandon in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the rocky ground. The wound was serious but not fatal, calculated to end his threat while preserving his life. The canyon fell silent except for Andrew's moaning and the distant sound of running water. Dorothy emerged from concealment, her rifle ready but pointed skyward. The immediate danger had passed. She approached the three wounded men with the same calm professionalism she'd once brought to arresting fugitives. Brandon was conscious but pale from blood loss. Larry Lee remained behind his boulder, hands visible and empty. Andrew had torn strips from his shirt to bind his leg wound. Dorothy kept her rifle ready as she addressed the defeated thieves. Here's what happens next. You're going to patch yourselves up and walk out of these mountains. You're going to forget you ever heard of Storm Runner or Dorothy Jackson. And you're going to spread the word that some things in this territory are still protected by people who remember how to protect them. Brandon struggled to sit up, pressing his good hand against his wounded shoulder. This isn't over, he said through gritted teeth. You can't watch your back forever. Dorothy's gray eyes were as cold as winter steel. Brandon, I've been watching my back for more than 20 years. I've survived things that would break men half your age. If you're smart, you'll take this lesson and disappear. If you're not smart, then the next time we meet, I won't be aiming to wound. She backed away from the wounded men, keeping them covered as she moved toward the meadow where the horses waited. Stormrunner nickered softly as she approached, recognizing her voice and scent. Dorothy ran her hands over the stallion's legs and body, checking for injuries. The thieves had handled him roughly, but he appeared unharmed. As Dorothy saddled both horses, she could hear the thieves arguing among themselves. Andrew was demanding that they seek medical attention immediately. Larry wanted to retreat to whatever hideout they'd been using. Brandon was still talking about revenge, though his voice lacked conviction. Dorothy mounted Copper and took Stormrunner's lead rope. She rode back to where the thieves were struggling to their feet. There's a doctor in Pine Creek 20 miles south, she told them. He doesn't ask questions about gunshot wounds. I suggest you head that direction before you bleed to death. Brandon looked up at her with a mixture of pain and grudging respect. Who are you really, lady? Dorothy considered the question for a moment. For 12 years, she'd been trying to forget who she used to be, but some identities couldn't be buried forever. I'm someone who wanted to be left alone, she said finally. You made that impossible. She turned both horses toward home, leaving the thieves to contemplate their mistakes and tend their wounds. The sun was fully up now, burning off the morning mist and revealing the stark beauty of the high country. Dorothy felt a familiar satisfaction, the same feeling she'd experienced after successfully completing difficult assignments during her marshal days. But as she rode toward her valley, Dorothy realized that something fundamental had changed. For 12 years, she'd lived as two separate people. Dorothy Campbell, the federal marshal, had been buried with her badge in a wooden chest. Dorothy Jackson, the widow and horse trainer, had been the only identity she'd allowed herself to claim. Now those two identities had merged back into a single person. She was still the woman who'd loved Tommen and honored his memory by building a peaceful life in the mountains. But she was also the woman who'd earned a legendary reputation by refusing to let criminals escape justice. The thieves had forced her to remember who she really was. Dorothy Jackson was both the widow and the warrior, and she no longer needed to choose between them. The ride home took most of the morning, following familiar trails that wound through stands of aspen and pine. Dorothy maintained a steady pace, alert for any sign that the thieves might have had additional associates waiting in ambush. But the mountains remained peaceful, disturbed only by the occasional deer or elk moving through the forest. Storm Runner traveled eagerly beside Copper, clearly happy to be heading home. The stallion's intelligence showed in the way he navigated the rocky terrain, picking his footing carefully and maintaining perfect spacing with Dorothy's mount. 3 years of training had created a bond between horse and rider that no thief could break. As they descended into Dorothy's valley, she could see smoke rising from her cabin's chimney. Someone was waiting for her. Dorothy's hand moved instinctively to her rifle, but she relaxed when she recognized the horse tied to her porch rail. The bay gelding belonged to Noah Roberts, the closest thing to a neighbor she had in this remote country. Noah ran a small ranch 15 miles down the mountain, and he occasionally stopped by to check on Dorothy during the harsh winter months. Noah emerged from the cabin as Dorothy rode into the yard. He was a man in his 60s, weathered by decades of mountain living, but still strong and capable. His eyes took in Dorothy's weapons and the way she sat her saddle, alert for trouble. "Heard shooting up in the high country last night," Noah said without preamble. "Thought I'd better check on you." Dorothy dismounted and began unsaddling both horses. "3 men took Storm Runner yesterday morning. I went to get him back." Noah's eyes widened slightly. "You went after horse thieves alone?" Dorothy's tone was matter of fact. It seemed like the appropriate response. Noah helped her carry the saddles into the barn, his movements careful and respectful. Dorothy had always appreciated that about Noah. He treated her as a competent adult rather than a helpless widow, but he was ready to offer assistance when needed. "You get your horse back," Noah observed. Dorothy smiled as she turned Storm Runner into the corral. "I did. The thieves decided they didn't want him after all." Noah studied Dorothy's face, noting details that most people would miss. The way she carried herself had changed overnight. The careful widow's posture had been replaced by something more confident and alert. Her eyes moved constantly, checking sight lines and potential threats in a way that suggested professional training. "Dorothy," Noah said carefully, "there's something different about you today." Dorothy considered how much to reveal. Noah had been a good neighbor and friend, but her past was dangerous knowledge. People who knew too much about Dorothy Campbell's history had a way of attracting unwanted attention. "I remembered some things I'd forgotten," she said finally. "Skills I thought I'd never need again." Noah nodded slowly. "We all got past, Dorothy, some darker than others, but what matters is who you choose to be today." Dorothy felt a surge of gratitude for Noah's wisdom. He was offering her the same gift she tried to give the thieves, the chance to move forward without judgment for past actions. "I choose to be someone who protects what's hers," Dorothy said, "and who helps her neighbors when they need it." Noah smiled and touched the brim of his hat. "That's good enough for me. You need anything, you know where to find me." After Noah left, Dorothy spent the afternoon returning to her normal routine. She fed the horses, checked the fence lines, and began preparing for the winter months that were approaching. But she also took time to clean and oil her weapons before returning them to the chest beneath her bed. The Winchester rifle, however, remained in the gun rack beside the door. Dorothy had learned that some tools shouldn't be put away too quickly. As evening approached, Dorothy sat on her porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun set behind the western peaks. The familiar routine was comforting, but she remained alert for any sign of trouble. Brandon Gutierrez's threats had been born of pain and humiliation, but Dorothy knew that wounded pride could be more dangerous than rational anger. The sound of approaching horses reached her ears just as full darkness settled over the valley. Dorothy set down her coffee and moved to the Winchester, checking that a round was chambered. 3 riders were approaching her cabin, moving slowly and openly in a way that suggested they didn't intend immediate violence. Dorothy stepped onto the porch with the rifle in her hands, not quite pointing it at the approaching riders, but making its presence clear. The lead horseman stopped 20 yards away and raised his hands to show they were empty. "Evening, ma'am," the rider called. "We're looking for some associates of ours who went missing in these mountains. Thought you might have seen them." Dorothy studied the 3 men carefully. They were better dressed and better armed than the thieves she'd confronted that morning. Their horses were quality animals, well cared for and properly equipped. These weren't desperate outlaws, but professionals of some kind. "Can't say I've seen anyone," Dorothy replied. "Don't get many visitors up here." The lead rider was a man in his 40s with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. His voice carried the educated accent of the eastern cities. Our associates were tracking a valuable horse that was stolen from our employer, he said. A black stallion with distinctive markings. Perhaps you've seen such an animal. Dorothy's grip tightened on the Winchester. These men weren't random thieves, but part of an organized operation. Someone with resources and connections had targeted Stormrunner specifically. I train horses, Dorothy said. I see a lot of different animals. You'd need to be more specific. The leader's smile was cold and professional. I think you know exactly which horse we're discussing, Mrs. Jackson. Our employer is prepared to pay handsomely for its return, more than it's worth to a simple horse trainer. Dorothy felt the familiar clarity that had always accompanied dangerous situations. These men represented a greater threat than the morning's thieves. They were intelligent, well-equipped, and backed by someone with significant resources. Your employer seems to be confused about ownership, Dorothy said calmly. All my horses are legally acquired and properly registered. The second rider spoke for the first time. Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding. That stallion belongs to Jeremy Anderson, one of the most powerful men in the territory. He's not accustomed to being told no. Dorothy had heard the name Jeremy Anderson. He owned mining interests throughout Montana and was rumored to have political connections that reached all the way to Washington. If Anderson wanted Stormrunner, he had the resources to take the horse through legal or illegal means. Mr. Anderson's reputation doesn't change the facts, Dorothy replied. Stormrunner was bred and trained on my property. He's mine by every law in the territory. The leader's patience was wearing thin. Mrs. Jackson, you're a woman alone in a very isolated location. Accidents happen in country like this. People disappear. It would be unfortunate if you were to suffer such a fate over a simple misunderstanding about horse ownership. Dorothy's voice remained level, but her eyes had gone cold as winter steel. That sounded like a threat. I don't respond well to threats. The third rider, who had remained silent until now, leaned forward in his saddle. Lady, you got no idea who you're dealing with. Mr. Anderson has resources you can't imagine. Judges, sheriffs, federal marshals, all of them owe him favors. Dorothy's smile held no warmth. Federal marshals. How interesting. She raised the Winchester slightly, not quite pointing it at the riders, but making her intentions clear. Gentlemen, I think this conversation is over. I suggest you return to Mr. Anderson and inform him that some things in this territory are not for sale at any price. The leader gathered his reins, his face dark with anger. This isn't finished, Mrs. Jackson. Mr. Anderson always gets what he wants. Dorothy's response was calm and final. Then Mr. Anderson is about to learn what disappointment feels like. The three riders turned and disappeared into the darkness, but Dorothy knew they would be back. Jeremy Anderson's reputation for ruthlessness was well established, and men like him didn't accept defeat gracefully. Dorothy returned to the cabin and retrieved her badge from the wooden chest. For 12 years, she'd been Dorothy Jackson, the quiet widow, but Jeremy Anderson had made a mistake that would cost him dearly. He'd threatened Dorothy Campbell, the ghost of Copper Ridge, and Dorothy Campbell had never lost a case. Dorothy spent the next morning preparing for war. She knew that Jeremy Anderson wouldn't accept her refusal, and his next approach would likely involve more than threats. Men with Anderson's resources and reputation had ways of dealing with obstacles that didn't respond to intimidation. Dorothy's first task was to gather intelligence on her opponent. She rode to Noah Roberts' ranch, knowing that her neighbor maintained contacts throughout the territory and would have information about Anderson's operations. Noah was mending fence when Dorothy arrived, but he set down his tools immediately when he saw her expression. You got trouble, he said without preamble. Dorothy dismounted and tied Copper to the fence rail. Jeremy Anderson wants Stormrunner. He sent men to make me an offer I couldn't refuse. Noah's weathered face went pale. Anderson. Dorothy, that man's got more power than the territorial governor. He owns judges, politicians, even some federal officials. Dorothy's smile was grim. I've dealt with corrupt officials before, Noah. They bleed just like honest men. Noah studied Dorothy's face, seeing something in her expression that confirmed his growing suspicions about her past. Dorothy, who were you before you came to this valley? Dorothy considered how much to reveal. Noah had been a loyal friend and neighbor, and he deserved to know what he might be getting involved in. I was a federal marshal, she said simply, for 8 years, before I married Thomas. Noah's eyes widened. The stories about the ghost of Copper Ridge. That was you, Dorothy nodded. I tried to leave that life behind when Thomas died. But some people won't let the past stay buried. Noah was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Then he straightened his shoulders and met Dorothy's gaze directly. What do you need, he said. Dorothy felt a surge of gratitude for Noah's loyalty. She'd forgotten how good it felt to have reliable allies. Information, she said. I need to know everything about Anderson's operations, his men, his resources, his weaknesses, and I need to get word to some old friends who might be willing to help. Noah nodded. I can handle the information gathering. Got contacts in every town from here to Helena. As for your old friends, there's a telegraph office in Pine Creek. Dorothy spent the rest of the morning composing carefully worded messages to former colleagues who might still be alive and willing to help. The Federal Marshal Service had been like a brotherhood, and Dorothy hoped that some of those bonds remained strong enough to survive 12 years of separation. The first message went to Brenda Johnson, who had been Dorothy's closest friend during their Marshal days. Brenda had retired to a ranch in Wyoming, but she'd maintained contacts throughout the law enforcement community. The second message went to Laura Wood, a former deputy who now worked as a private investigator in Denver. Laura owed Dorothy her life from an incident involving claim jumpers near Leadville, and Dorothy hoped that debt would motivate her to provide assistance. The third message was the most important. It went to Jessica Watson, who had taken over Dorothy's territory when she retired. If Jessica was still wearing a badge, she had the authority to investigate Anderson's operations officially. While Dorothy was sending her messages, Noah was gathering information from his network of contacts throughout the territory. By evening, he'd assembled a disturbing picture of Jeremy Anderson's power and methods. Anderson owned 3 major mining operations and had controlling interests in several smaller claims. He employed over 200 men, including a private security force that operated with minimal oversight from territorial authorities. His political connections reached from the territorial capital to Washington, D.C., and he'd used those connections to acquire mining rights through questionable means. Most troubling was Anderson's reputation for dealing with opposition. Several small ranchers who'd refused to sell their land to Anderson's mining operations had suffered mysterious accidents. A newspaper editor who'd criticized Anderson's methods had been found dead in an apparent robbery. A territorial judge who'd ruled against Anderson's interests had been transferred to a remote posting in Alaska. Dorothy listened to Noah's report with growing anger. Anderson was exactly the type of corrupt power broker she'd spent her Marshal days fighting. Men who believed that wealth and influence placed them above the law. Noah finished his report and looked at Dorothy expectantly. What's your plan? Dorothy's eyes were cold as winter steel. I'm going to remind Mr. Anderson that some people still believe in justice. That night, Dorothy received responses to 2 of her telegraph messages. Brenda Johnson's reply was brief but encouraging. Quote 0. Laura Wood's message was even more direct. Anderson killed my cousin last year. Personal now. Coming with full kit. Jessica Watson's response didn't arrive until the following morning, but it was worth the wait. Anderson under federal investigation for mail fraud and conspiracy. Need evidence to make charges stick. We'll coordinate with your operation. Dorothy smiled as she read Jessica's message. The federal government was already interested in Anderson's activities. With official backing and experienced allies, Dorothy had a chance to do more than simply protect her horse. She could bring down Anderson's entire criminal operation. But first, she had to survive Anderson's next move. The attack came 2 nights later, just after midnight. Dorothy had been expecting it, and she was ready. She'd positioned herself in the barn with clear sight lines to the cabin and surrounding area. Storm Runner and the other horses had been moved to a hidden corral a quarter-mile away, safely out of range of any fighting. Dorothy heard the attackers approaching long before they reached the cabin. 6 men on horseback, moving with the discipline of professional soldiers. They dismounted 100 yards from the building and approached on foot, spreading out to surround the structure. Dorothy smiled grimly. Anderson had sent professionals this time, but he'd made a crucial mistake. His men were attacking a cabin they thought contained a helpless widow. Instead, they were walking into a trap prepared by one of the most effective federal marshals in territorial history. Dorothy had spent the day preparing the battlefield. She'd placed spare weapons and ammunition at strategic locations around the property. She'd identified covered routes between defensive positions. Most importantly, she'd prepared surprises that would give her a decisive advantage despite being outnumbered. The first attacker reached the cabin and peered through a window. Dorothy's shot took him cleanly, dropping him without a sound. The other 5 men reacted with professional speed, taking cover and beginning to coordinate their assault. But Dorothy was no longer in the barn. She'd moved to a position near the corral, using the darkness and her intimate knowledge of the terrain to stay ahead of her opponents. The attackers discovered that the cabin was empty when they broke down the door. Dorothy's voice carried through the night air from an unexpected direction. "Looking for someone, gentlemen." The professional spun toward the sound of her voice, but Dorothy had already moved again. She was using the same tactics that had made her legendary during her martial days, appearing where her opponents least expected, striking with precision, and disappearing before they could respond effectively. Dorothy's second shot wounded one of the attackers, and her third shot disabled another. The remaining 3 men realized they were facing an opponent far more dangerous than they'd been led to believe. One of the survivors called out in the darkness, "We know you're Dorothy Campbell. Anderson knows who you really are." Dorothy's laugh echoed off the mountains. "Then Anderson should have known better than to threaten me." The battle continued through the long hours before dawn, with Dorothy systematically eliminating Anderson's men while remaining invisible in the darkness. By sunrise, 4 of the attackers were dead or wounded, and the remaining 2 had fled into the mountains. Dorothy emerged from concealment as the sun painted the eastern peaks. She'd proven that the ghost of Copper Ridge was far from dead, but she knew that Anderson would respond to this defeat with even greater force. The war was just beginning. The sound of approaching horses reached Dorothy's ears as she was dragging the last of Anderson's men away from her cabin. But these riders approached openly, calling out their names and intentions. Dorothy's reinforcements had arrived. Brenda Johnson rode into the yard first, looking exactly as Dorothy remembered her. Tall and lean, with silver-streaked brown hair, and the confident bearing of someone who'd spent decades enforcing the law in dangerous territory. Behind her rode Laura Wood, younger but equally capable, with the sharp eyes of a professional investigator. "Dorothy," Brenda called out, "you look like you've been having a party without us." Dorothy gestured toward the wounded attackers. "Anderson sent a welcoming committee. I thought it would be rude not to return their hospitality." Laura dismounted and examined the scene with professional interest. 6 against 1. You haven't lost your touch. Dorothy smiled grimly, like riding a horse. Some skills you never forget. The 3 women spent the morning planning their campaign against Anderson's operations. Brenda had brought intelligence gathered from her contacts throughout the territory. Laura had detailed information about Anderson's business dealings and political connections. Dorothy contributed her intimate knowledge of the local terrain and her growing understanding of Anderson's methods. Their strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than wait for Anderson to attack again, they would take the fight to him. Dorothy would continue to be the visible target, drawing Anderson's attention and resources. Meanwhile, Brenda and Laura would gather evidence of Anderson's criminal activities and coordinate with Jessica Watson's federal investigation. The plan required Dorothy to make herself even more of a target than she already was. Anderson's pride had been wounded by the failure of his attack, and he would likely respond with overwhelming force. Dorothy would have to survive long enough for her allies to complete their missions. But Dorothy had spent years surviving impossible odds. She was ready for whatever Anderson could send against her. The next phase of Anderson's campaign began 3 days later. Instead of sending more gunmen, he chose to attack Dorothy through legal channels. A territorial judge issued a warrant for Dorothy's arrest on charges of murder and assault. The warrant was signed by Judge Harrison Mitchell, one of Anderson's known associates. Dorothy wasn't surprised when Sheriff William Hayes arrived at her cabin with a deputy and the arrest warrant. Hayes was an honest lawman caught in an impossible situation. He had to serve the warrant, but he clearly didn't believe the charges were legitimate. "Dorothy," Hayes said uncomfortably, "you know I got to do this, but I want you to know I think these charges are garbage." Dorothy nodded calmly. "I understand your position, Sheriff, but I'm not going quietly to Anderson's jail." Hayes sighed. "Dorothy, I got 20 men waiting down the trail. Anderson insisted on a show of force. You can't fight all of them." Dorothy's smile was confident. "Sheriff, You obviously haven't heard all the stories about the ghost of Copper Ridge. What followed was a running battle through the mountain wilderness that became legendary in territorial history. Dorothy used her knowledge of the terrain to stay ahead of the posse while picking off Anderson's men with precision shooting. She led them through box canyons and across treacherous slopes, turning the pursuit into a nightmare for the hunters. By the end of the second day, half of Anderson's men had been wounded or killed. The survivors were exhausted, demoralized, and beginning to question whether any amount of money was worth facing the ghost of Copper Ridge. Sheriff Hayes finally called off the pursuit when his own deputy was wounded in an ambush Dorothy had set near Devil's Canyon. The lawman had done his duty by attempting to serve the warrant, but he wasn't willing to sacrifice more lives for Anderson's vendetta. While Dorothy was leading Anderson's forces on their futile chase through the mountains, Brenda and Laura were conducting their own operations against Anderson's empire. Brenda had infiltrated Anderson's mining operations, posing as a widow looking for work. She discovered evidence of unsafe working conditions, wage theft, and the use of intimidation against workers who complained. Laura had focused on Anderson's business dealings, following paper trails that revealed a pattern of fraud and corruption. Anderson had been using his political connections to acquire mining rights through forged documents and bribery. He'd also been manipulating territorial land records to steal property from small ranchers and homesteaders. Most damaging was Laura's discovery of Anderson's connection to a series of mysterious deaths throughout the territory. The victims had all been people who'd opposed Anderson's interests or possessed information that could damage his operations. Jessica Watson arrived from Denver with federal warrants just as Dorothy was returning from her mountain chase. The federal marshal brought news that Anderson's criminal activities had attracted attention in Washington. The territorial government was being pressured to take in action against corruption, and Anderson had been identified as a primary target. But Anderson wasn't finished. His legal maneuvers had failed, and his direct attacks had been defeated. Now he was preparing for a final assault that would either destroy Dorothy completely or cost him everything he'd built. The climactic battle began at dawn on a cold October morning. Anderson had assembled every available man from his mining operations and security forces. Over 50 armed men surrounded Dorothy's valley, preparing to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. Dorothy had chosen her defensive positions carefully. The valley's narrow entrance could be held by a small force against much larger numbers. The rocky terrain provided excellent cover and concealment. Most importantly, Dorothy had prepared surprises that would give her a decisive advantage despite being vastly outnumbered. Brenda and Laura had taken positions on the high ridges overlooking the valley where their rifles could command the approaches to Dorothy's cabin. Jessica Watson had established a command post near the valley entrance, coordinating with territorial authorities who were finally moving against Anderson's operations. Dorothy herself had positioned herself in the same rocky outcropping where she'd first confronted Brandon Gutierrez and his thieves. The circle was closing, and Dorothy intended to finish what Anderson had started. Anderson himself led the final assault, riding at the head of his private army with the confidence of a man who believed that superior numbers guaranteed victory. He'd made the same mistake that had doomed countless criminals during Dorothy's martial days, underestimating the power of competence, preparation, and righteous anger. The battle that followed became the stuff of legend throughout the Montana Territory. Dorothy and her allies used every advantage of terrain, tactics, and superior marksmanship to defeat Anderson's forces. The ghost of Copper Ridge had returned in full deadly glory, and Anderson's men learned why that name had once struck fear into the hearts of outlaws throughout the region. The final confrontation between Dorothy and Jeremy Anderson took place in the same rocky outcropping where she'd first demonstrated that the ghost of Copper Ridge was far from dead. Anderson's forces had been systematically destroyed by superior tactics and marksmanship, leaving only the mining baron himself and a handful of his most loyal men. Anderson climbed toward Dorothy's position with the desperate determination of a man who knew his empire was crumbling around him. His political connections had abandoned him when federal investigators began examining his operations. His business associates had distanced themselves when evidence of his criminal activities became public. His hired guns had either fled or been eliminated by Dorothy and her allies. Now Anderson faced the woman who had destroyed everything he'd built, and he intended to settle the matter personally. Dorothy watched Anderson's approach with the calm patience that had always characterized her most dangerous moments. She'd reloaded her Winchester and checked her revolvers, but she suspected that this final confrontation would be decided by words as much as weapons. Anderson reached the rocky outcropping and stood 20 feet from Dorothy's position, his expensive clothes torn and stained from the climb. His face was flushed with exertion and rage, but his eyes held the calculating intelligence that had made him one of the territory's most powerful men. "Dorothy Campbell," Anderson called out, breathing heavily. "The legendary ghost of Copper Ridge." "I should have known." Dorothy emerged from concealment, her rifle held ready but not quite pointed at Anderson. She'd removed her widow's bonnet, and her silver-streaked hair caught the morning sunlight. Her steel-gray eyes were as cold and implacable as winter. "You should have left me alone, Jeremy," she said calmly. "I tried to warn you." Anderson's laugh was bitter. "Left you alone? Do you have any idea what you've cost me? My mining operations are shut down. My political allies have turned against me. My reputation is destroyed." Dorothy's expression didn't change. "You destroyed your own reputation, Jeremy. I just made sure people knew the truth about your methods." Anderson drew his revolver with surprising speed, but Dorothy had been expecting the move. Her Winchester was already tracking toward him when his weapon cleared leather. The two shots came almost simultaneously, but Dorothy's was a fraction of a second faster and infinitely more accurate. Anderson's bullet went wide, chipping rock near Dorothy's shoulder. Dorothy's shot took Anderson's center mass, spinning him around and dropping him to the rocky ground. Dorothy approached the fallen mining baron carefully, her rifle ready for any final surprises. But Anderson was finished. The wound was mortal, and they both knew it. Anderson looked up at Dorothy with a mixture of pain and grudging respect. "How long?" he whispered. "How long were you a marshal?" 8 years, Dorothy replied. "Long enough to learn that men like you always destroy themselves eventually. I just helped speed up the process." Anderson coughed, and blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. The horse. Storm Runner. Why was he so important? Dorothy's expression softened slightly. "He was the last project my husband and I worked on together." "Some things are worth more than money, Jeremy. You never understood that." Anderson's eyes were growing dim, but he managed one final question. "What happens now?" Dorothy looked out over the valley where she tried to build a peaceful life. "Now I go back to being Dorothy Jackson," she said. "But I don't forget who Dorothy Campbell was." Anderson died as the sun reached its zenith, bringing an end to one of the territory's most corrupt and powerful criminal enterprises. The federal investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Anderson's crimes, leading to reforms in territorial government and the prosecution of dozens of his associates. Dorothy returned to her cabin to find Storm Runner waiting in the corral, apparently unconcerned by the morning's violence. The stallion nickered softly as she approached, and Dorothy felt the familiar peace that came from working with the animals she loved. Brenda, Laura, and Jessica joined Dorothy on her porch that evening, sharing a bottle of whiskey and watching the sun set behind the western peaks. The four women had fought together against corruption and won, but they all knew that such victories were temporary. There would always be other Jeremy Andersons, other men who believed that power gave them the right to take whatever they wanted. But there would also always be people like Dorothy Campbell, people who remembered that justice was worth fighting for regardless of the personal cost. Brenda raised her glass in a toast. "To the ghost of Copper Ridge," she said. "May she never be needed, but may she always be ready." Dorothy smiled and raised her own glass. "To friends who answer the call," she replied, "and to the memory of those who taught us that some things are worth protecting." The four women drank in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they could rest in the satisfaction of a job well done. Dorothy had learned that she could be both the peaceful widow and the legendary marshal. The two identities weren't contradictory, but complementary, each giving meaning and strength to the other. The ghost of Copper Ridge was at peace, but she was also ready. And in the Montana Territory of 1878, that was exactly what the situation required. As her friends prepared to leave the next morning, Dorothy stood in her doorway watching them saddle their horses. Each woman was returning to her own life and responsibilities. But Dorothy knew that the bonds forged in battle would endure. Noah Roberts arrived as the others were departing, bringing news from the territorial capital. The governor had officially commended Dorothy for her role in exposing Anderson's criminal enterprise. More importantly, new laws were being drafted to prevent the kind of corruption that had allowed Anderson to operate with impunity for so many years. Dorothy accepted the news with quiet satisfaction. She'd never sought recognition for her work as a marshal, and she didn't need it now. The knowledge that justice had been served was reward enough. Stormrunner grazed peacefully in the corral, his black coat gleaming in the morning sunlight. Dorothy had protected what was hers, but she'd also discovered something more valuable. The understanding that her past and present could coexist without contradiction. She was Dorothy Jackson, the widow who trained horses in a remote mountain valley. She was also Dorothy Campbell, the ghost of Copper Ridge, one of the most effective federal marshals in territorial history. Both identities were true, and both were necessary. The mountains stretched away in all directions, best and beautiful and dangerous. Dorothy had chosen this place for its isolation, but she'd learned that true peace came not from hiding from the world, but from being prepared to face whatever challenges it might bring. She'd spent 12 years trying to bury the past, but some things couldn't be buried forever. The skills that had made her legendary were part of who she was, just as much as her love for Thomas and her dedication to the life they'd built together. Dorothy walked to the corral and ran her hand along Stormrunner's neck. The stallion was safe, her valley was secure, and justice had been served. For now, that was enough. But Dorothy kept her weapons cleaned and ready, because she'd learned that peace was something that had to be protected by those strong enough and skilled enough to do the protecting. The ghost of Copper Ridge was at rest, but she was never truly gone. And in the wild country of the Montana Territory, that was exactly as it should be.